Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's DesignPopUp virtual panel. Let me ask our fantastic panelists to reveal themselves and show their beautiful faces. There you go. Thank you very much. So today we are talking about how architecture can help our health and well-being. And this is a topic that is very, very close to my heart, so I'm very excited about today's sessions. Let me see where Philip is and Rosalie. Here you go. So good morning, and again, welcome to today's sessions. First of all, we have a fantastic new sponsor that have decided to support us, which is absolutely fantastic. So thanks to Schroeter, who's joining Domus Styles in supporting this series of events. So today with us, and we have a very international panel, I would like to welcome Philip Gray from BDP. Philip is the head of sustainability, and he has a passion for sustainability and environmental preservation and is committed to low energy and cost-effective environmental design. His team has an impressive portfolio of environmental assessments, strategic development documents, and environmental management enhancements. That's all big words for me. Apologies, I get stuck. Philip has contributed to a wide range of projects across all sectors and has extensive experience in making these spaces better. He led the environmental design strategy for the new low-carbon enterprise centre at the University of East Anglia, now considered one of the most sustainable buildings in the UK. Also with us today from Stockholm is Dr. Ute Bezenecke. Ute is associate professor in lighting design at the School of Architecture and the Built Environment, KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. She's a design researcher and educator focusing on the impact of lighting on human perception, behavior, and well-being in spatial environment, with special interest in facilitating interdisciplinary collaboration involving mixed methods, research in design, art, engineering, and the science. Her background spans academic human factors research, as well as professional practice in lighting design, policy development, product management, and architecture. Also with us today from London, but with Irish origins, and the very international panel, is Darren Prior, light designer at There Is Light. Darren trained as an architect at the Queen's University in Belfast and later graduated with a first-class master in architectural lighting design from KTH University of Stockholm. His thesis discussed the social environmental impacts of design. He's been involved in all sorts of very interesting projects through a variety, across variety of sectors, leading on projects ranging from commercial hospitality and high-end residential to museum exhibitions. Some of more notable projects include the Holland Green by OMAA with Allies and Morrisons and John Posen, which was awarded the RIBA London Award in 2017, and the Truman Social Club, winner of the 2021 Lit Awards and currently shortlisted for Dark Awards 2021. In the residential sector, he led the lighting design for a hypoallergenic home, which was featured on Grand Designs, which actually is what gave me the idea of today's seminar. So that's very appropriate. Last but not least, from Glasgow, is Rosalina Menon. She's a senior lecturer and researcher at the Glasgow School of Art. Rosalie has been teaching and researching at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in Glasgow since 2005. She's a co-director of the Mackintosh Environmental Architectural Research Unit, which has an established track record of high-quality research into environmental architecture. Her research into indoor air quality and associated health and well-being in houses has been presented in both academic journals and international conferences. So this morning format is a slightly different than we done in some of the other sessions. So I would like the panelists to have a very, very short intro to talk about more about themselves and their work. And then, as usual, we'll kick off with the questions. So if you want to Remember, if you want to ask questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A section on here on Zoom. So we shall kick off with you, Philip. Good morning.
Good morning. Sorry about that. Immediate technical issues. Right. Let's get going.
Yeah.
1 second. Just looking for my documentation. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Cool.
All clear.
Okay. So hello, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Sarah. So there's obviously a lot of ground to cover, so I'll go swiftly. So very briefly about BDP. We're about 1,200 people around the world, about just shy of 1,000 in the UK. We cover all sectors. We're an inter or multidisciplinary practice, so architecture, civil and structural engineering, urban design, landscape architecture, urban planning, acoustics, lighting, and building services engineering. And at the heart of that sit me and my team, which are our sustainability function, our sustainability profession. And we are multi-sector, so we work across education, healthcare, heritage, a big drive in heritage at the moment, sport, transport, you name it, we've got some track in it. So moving on, I mean, where we start with health and wellbeing in the built environment, that it's a big arena. So I thought I'd posit these few slides in sort of increasing level of detail, increasing granularity in the work that my team and I do, and how we support our colleagues across the practice. So starting at sort of master plan scale, what some of these issues, how these issues manifest themselves. So we're looking at things like energy and infrastructure to ensure we've got climate change resilience and adaptability, the massing and form of the various components of the master plan to optimize comfort, both internally and within the sort of streetscape. We obviously want a mix of functions to support sort of vibrancy and 24-hour use, and that contributes to things like passive security and those local economies. We make sure we understand the microclimate, so we can use the buildings and the topography and the natural features to support both, again, pedestrian comfort, streetscapes, and indeed building performance. Jumping to the top right, biodiversity, green and blue infrastructure, really important in our work, and how we can use and maximise the sort of benefit that the ecosystem services provide to people. We've obviously got to think about sense of place. Why are we doing this? What's going to draw people to it? How do we ensure people engage with it? So that provision of and integration with community infrastructure is really critical. And things like transport. We've got to make sure that people can get to and from and move around comfortably and carefully and safely. Driving or drilling then down into the local scale, when we're looking at the massing of the buildings, we obviously want to maximise daylight penetration. We start to think about the stacking and adjacencies to optimise both servicing strategies and engineering strategies. Modularity, both to improve the potential risks associated with construction, but also ongoing maintenance once the thing's up and running. Flexibility and adaptability of space to ensure that the people within the building can use it as they need to or want to. Facade strategies to maximise comfort, connections to external realm, indoor-outdoor spaces and that commonality of materials. How we can use outdoor space, that amenity space, to provide multifunction and outdoor teaching areas and that sort of thing. Non-discriminatory shared surfaces, again, to make sure people can move around comfortably and safely. And then ultimately driving to deliver sort of net positive buildings that don't have a detrimental impact both on their immediate site and their surroundings. And then drilling right into the building. That sort of transposes itself into things like passive ventilation strategies, the solar shading that I mentioned, how we promote activity and movement through and around buildings, utilising daylight, but only where it's useful, and making sure that people that are inside can see out and make those connections. Indirect and direct biophilia, responsive and controllable artificial lighting, which Darren and Uta will talk far more about and far more intelligently about than I will. Material selections, I'll maybe talk a bit more about that later, but making sure that the off-gassing and things of the components that we're putting in are minimised. We want to make sure that sensors and smart building tech allows spaces to function and people to control the internal environment. We're doing a lot of work in sort of neurodiversity, accessibility, intuitive wayfinding. So that's really important. Colour schemes, typefaces, all those sorts of things to make sure that we again are non-discriminatory. Low impact FF&E, again back to off-gassing. And then critically ensuring people can use the spaces they want to, that we can adapt and change the function of those spaces through movable furniture and adaptive servicing. So that's a very quick canter through. hopefully that gives a broad sort of introduction to some of the themes that hopefully we'll talk about in a bit more detail.
Fantastic. Well, you already gave me ideas for another 5 questions to ask you, so that's perfect. Ute, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me share the screen. So hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Ute Besenecker. I work as Associate Professor in Lighting Design at KTH in Stockholm. And I'm very honored to join this morning's interdisciplinary panel to discuss how we can increase health benefits in architecture. And there are so many aspects, and some of them Philip already mentioned. With a prior background in architecture, now my specific field of work and interest is lighting design. And since 2019, I work at KTH, which is Sweden's largest and oldest technical research and educational institution, founded in 1827. And the division of lighting design is part of the School of Architecture and located on the Stockholm campus in the very distinct architecture school building and in the cloud, as we call our rooftop glasshouse facility. Currently, we are 9 in the division, with 1 PhD student about to be recruited, so we will soon be 10. Most people are involved in the Master in Lighting Design and the Architecture and Daylight education. And since I joined in 2019, we also started several research projects related both to outdoor lighting and also indoor lighting in learning environments and general luminous color mixing research. We are also involved in the Light for Health Consortium, where 6 international partner universities funded by the EU's Erasmus Plus program are working on integrating some of the knowledge developed in the health sciences into lighting design education. And when talking about healthful architectural lighting or lighting for well-being, it is really important to realize that our well-being mediated by lighting is comprised of many factors. Some of them are related to what we perceive through our senses, for example, what we see. It impacts our psychological and emotional well-being, and others are related to our physiological health. And working with lighting includes both. It includes daylighting and it includes electrical lighting. And the first layer, I think, should always be designing with daylight. We have openings that give us views and connections to the outdoors, and we evolve with natural fluctuations and rhythms of light and the full spectrum and high intensity of daylight. And when designing electrical lighting solutions, we now can control and customize and optimize. And this provides opportunities to complement and add light when not enough daylight is available. But the quality is really depending on our design, and we are still learning what quality characteristics are actually important for well-being and how to prevent challenges like flicker, for example, which then can introduce migraine or headaches. Generally, there's a long history to design for visual qualities, color perception, brightness, distributions to support visual performance and prevent annoying glare. But designing with human physiology in mind has started only recently. And research findings about how light actually impacts human circadian rhythms, alertness, mood, and other outcomes are increasingly available. But we are still working on learning what that could actually mean for designing with lighting, electrical and daylight in architectural contexts. And the International Commission on Illumination has issued a position statement a few years ago stating that integrative lighting is the official term for lighting that is specifically intended to integrate visual and non-visual effects and producing physiological and psychological effects. And so recently, to add to measurement tools targeting vision, an international working group actually developed a measure called the melanopic EDI, equivalent daylight illuminance, enabling comparing solutions for their potential impact on non-visual effects such as alertness, circadian entrainment, and so on. And so a high EDI is generally recommended for daytime. It sort of mimics a sunny day. And a low EDI is recommended for the evening, sort of mimicking the after sunset dark. And so far, we have evaluated lighting in terms of visual performance. And for that, our eye is most sensitive to a very specific range of light frequencies. We typically use a unit called lux, which we can measure with any light meter. But not only vision, for example, our circadian physiology is also mediated by light, which we now know. But the peak sensitivity is different than that for vision, because other photoreceptors in the eye are involved. And so now, all of a sudden, we know that that means that a different range of light frequencies is needed to optimally support our physiology. So with this melanopic EDI measure, we can compare the potential of an LED source, for example, and daylight to impact, for example, the daily sleep-wake cycle. And so to sum up, the type of lighting to support certain physiological effects is not necessarily the same as the type of lighting needed for visual perception. Our sensory system has evolved under daylight, which caters well to both physiology and to vision. However, when we design with electrical lighting, that lighting is engineered and optimized to fulfill certain specific criteria. We need to have it bright enough. We need to not trip and fall. We need to distinguish colors. But knowledge about criteria that support human physiology has only been developed recently. And in architecture, criteria need to be integrated to support both physiology and vision. Both should complement and supplement each other. And the criteria are currently not yet coordinated and integrated. So that is all in process. And there is an interesting new area of practice-based research. But generally, architects and lighting designers continue to use their creativity and experience. But now, in addition, we also have these added metrics and methods that are available and help to evaluate and compare how a design concept and a solution could impact both vision and physiology. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I know this was a lot in a very short time.
Thank you very much, Ute. Darren, please, thank you.
Let me see where we are. So yeah, hello, my name is Darren, as Sarah already introduced. I'm a lighting designer based in London. And what that essentially means is that we use light as a medium to look to improve the architecture or the built environment around us. Light is essentially a communicator. It evokes emotion within the observer, shaping our perception of the reality and the world around us. So yeah, it's quite crucial to how we perceive things. And with that, it's when we talk about our visual system, it's the photoreceptors, as you already mentioned, the rods and cones that absorb the light and transfers it to our brain, which then builds the perception of the world around us. And it's with that knowledge that we as lighting designers look to shape, I suppose, light and shadow and color with material, depending on the use and the type of space and the people who will use it to achieve performance of a particular task. It can also be used to create hierarchy within space, which then helps us in wayfinding. Again, that can be used to varying degrees of intensity of light, where we see here with the ambient light source of the main entrance, or could be used with more accent forms to create focal points for eyes to kind of distinguish between different spaces. And again, we see a lot in hospitality. It can really be used to manipulate and kind of evoke a certain mood or feeling of comfort, and we can we can really use like the color temperature here to create a feeling of relaxation, or again, cooler color temperatures to excite people as well. But as you mentioned as well, we've recently discovered that there's in fact a third photoreceptor in the eye, and with that, it actually is very specific to a particular spectrum, and that is almost completely different to how we consider visual comfort through the rods and cones. This, as we now know, human activity functions according to a rhythm determined by nature. And until the invention of artificial lighting, it was the sun that decided that people's daily activities by waking up and when to go to sleep. And unfortunately, we are now not receiving enough access to daylight because we spend so much time indoors and with that constant intensity of light throughout the day. In fact, that can actually deregulate our circadian rhythms. And what we're finding now is a whole myriad of illnesses causing that. We do know, however, some facts. I'll just move this out of the way so you can see. Even though the research is ongoing and there's a lot of different frames of thought, we do know categorically that daylight has a positive effect on our health and well-being. And is in fact the shift in color from sunrise through midday, sunset, and to darkness that impacts this non-visual system, which resets the body clock and adjusts our alertness and sleep. It's in fact, like I said before, it's a specific spectrum of blue light and the intensity of that suppresses the melatonin hormone, and in fact creates or enhances our alertness. And it's just that we're trying to work with to understand more and how we can achieve healthy lighting. As Ute also mentioned, daylight is a must. There is no current substitute for the qualities that daylight bring, and it needs to be essential to pretty much all of our thinking when it comes to holistic lighting. And yes, we actually know that circadian rhythm disorders can lead to health issues such as cardiovascular disease, hormonal imbalance, chronic fatigue, and depression. So it is quite a serious topic and one that can't be overlooked. There are a number of challenges, unfortunately, because this is a relatively new discussion topic, and there's a lot of research. There's no current agreement on what healthy lighting should be. Unfortunately, there's actually no criteria absolutely what it should not be either, which is more worrying. Because we have the potential to do more harm than good. Lead our way through this. There is a commercial expense, and it's the difficulty in how we measure the return on a light fitting in regard to a person's health and well-being. Unfortunately, we do live in a world of economics, and we have to consider this. The cost of land in building in cities are such that developers maximize footprint and building height, which leads to huge deep plan offices with little or no quality of view. So that is a serious issue, and in a world that we're becoming more and more urbanized, one will become more and more relevant as well that we need to tackle. And again, our current healthy lighting guidelines contradict workplace lighting standards. So as you were saying, standards tell us that we need a constant light level on our desk, on our work surfaces for visual performance, but healthy lighting and this notion of integrative light tells us that we need four times as much light level during the day and very, very low levels during the night. So there's certain contradictions here that we need to overcome. And I guess just moving forward, and again, we'll discuss, I'm sure, a lot of these topics later on in Q&A, but just some considerations when it comes to healthy lighting. Phil mentioned before about adaptive lighting, which with a great increase in technology and improvements, it's becoming easier and easier to install adaptive and smart control systems for all kinds of budgets, if that's new builds or retrofit. So again, positive news. We do actually, because there's such a contradicting in the different standards, we need to probably consider all of them to try and paint a more holistic view of what's actually needed moving forward. And it's we can't not discuss it, but with COVID, I think is and the lockdown, we've really started to begin thinking about adoption of agile working, and this will have a really positive effect on our well-being and task-based design and how we organize buildings, how we use them, because they are essentially tools, and how efficiently we use them. And they're all in all just a holistic approach, and how it will be used and who it will be used for, I think is most important and should be based on every single design decision. And that concludes a very quick introduction to lighting design and where we come from.
Thank you very much. Rosalie, our homes expert, please.
Okay, just a moment. Okay, just 1 second. All right, I'll just bring this up. Okay, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and to everybody else's. I'll keep this fairly short, and that's partly, I'm just checking, everybody can see my screen at the moment. Yeah, so I'm Rosalina Menon, as Sarah introduced. I'm an architect, a qualified architect, an educator, researcher. I've been working at the Macintosh School of Architecture within a research unit called MIRU, which is the Macintosh Environmental Architecture Research Unit. That's why we have an acronym, because it's quite a mouthful. And we've been looking at sustainable sort of environmental design solutions for quite some time now. We're a team of architects, engineers, researchers. More recently, we've been doing a lot of post-occupancy evaluation. We do a lot of building monitoring. So a lot of the homes that have been produced recently are, you know, meeting some low energy criteria, but we've been going in there and trying to evaluate just how they're operating once the occupants have actually moved in. So there's quite a lot of sort of technical data that we gather. And one of the consistent themes that we have been looking at is healthy housing. So a lot of the research that we've done, we've been working closely with housing associations. This is particularly pertinent just now when we've spent so much time in lockdown, and I think we're all looking at our homes in a slightly different way, thinking about how we use our homes. We're having to adapt a little. And one of the things that my particular interest in is looking at designing for the everyday. It's those kind of really mundane things that you have to do in your home that maybe aren't necessarily planned for in an architectural sense. And I think they may be used to, and modern housing has maybe lost the kind of critical need for some of these spaces. And so some of these spaces that I'm interested in are, where do you dry your clothes? You know, where do you, you've maybe had a shower and you've got a wet towel, where are you going to dry that? And all of those begin to have not only kind of well-being impacts, because nobody wants to live in a mess and a clutter, but also the environmental impact in terms of what's that like for your relative humidity levels within the home? What impact does that have? Does that then produce quite an unhealthy indoor air quality? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. One of the projects specifically that we worked on was 10 years ago now, but that was called Healthy Home Laundering. And it really was challenging. It was quite a large scale study actually. And we were looking at what the implications were. And normally at this time when I would be in a lecture hall, I might ask the audience, so where do you dry your clothes? And I normally ask for a show of hands. And it's amazing, yeah. Everybody, it's, doesn't matter what age, what gender, what ethnicity, what income group, everybody will probably sheepishly admit to, yeah, I've got mine on the radiator, or yeah. So it's a it's a very ubiquitous problem, and it's one that's not very glamorous. It's not really talked about much in the architecture. And so these are the spaces that I think we as architects, we need to design a wee bit better, and we need to design into the homes. We've done a lot of research into, I'm going to try and move my slide on here. We've looked at monitoring a lot of these homes to see what the impact is. And we can see, especially in that study, the environmental laundry one, was we could see that about 95% of people were drying indoors. 75% of those had R8 relative humidity levels that were way above a safe normal. And then we also did investigations into sort of air sampling as well to see what like mold spores were in the air. And we worked with a project partner to analyse those. So it was a particularly interesting study, but we've replicated that study just through other post-occupancy monitoring that we've done. We've investigated how the habits are. And it's interesting to see that over the last 10 years, we're still seeing the same sort of trends. We're seeing a lot, and it's particularly important because buildings are being designed, or certainly housing is a lot smaller than it used to be. So you've got kind of smaller enclosed spaces. You've got lower ceiling heights. And so it then begins to have a greater impact in terms of how somebody maybe feels within that space. If it's quite damp, if it's if you're maybe looking at mold growth. So all of those things begin to create quite an unhealthy indoor environment. Coupled with that, we're also looking at a lot more systems in terms of mechanical ventilation, which you can see just from that slide. If it's not maintained properly, then you're actually circulating quite unhealthy air within the space as well, or the system just isn't working the way it's supposed to be. And we're trying to design buildings now which are more energy efficient, they're super insulated, so you don't really get that opportunity for natural ventilation the way we used to. And I think, again, COVID has really thrown that up. And we're beginning to think, oh my gosh, we don't want to go back into these spaces that are mechanically ventilated. Ideally, we want to return to sort of a passive way of operating our homes. And I do feel that the healthiest homes are the ones that we can control, that we have control over. We don't want to be controlled by a mechanical system that's subject to failure or to poor installation. So that's a kind of overview. I'm conscious that this morning session is probably more about Q&A, and people may have questions around this. So this is a very sort of basic introduction to some of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years.
Thank you very much. Well, since we are with you, especially as you say, recently, well, the last 12 months, our homes all of a sudden have become the main environment, well, for most of us. We work from home, we study from home, we are stay at home, and stuff like that. So, Rosalie, what do we actually need to think about to make sure our homes are not affecting? We're struggling enough with the well-being because of all the restrictions, but physically, what is it that we can focus on? I don't know, open the windows more often, don't put your laundry in the radiators. What other aspects do you think is important that we do as a sort of a quick fix to make sure we are safe and healthy in our homes?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to different things. There's occupant habits and behaviours, and there are situations where we may need to change some of those. There will also be situations where no matter how, our environment can't be altered. And I think those are kind of quite important issues as designers. But I would say, I mean, in terms of the most healthy buildings are the ones we want to spend time in, the ones that have a good combination of light and space, as Darren and Uta have already talked about this morning. And we also need good levels of thermal comfort. So for me, the most attractive buildings are those that you can go and find a nice, comfortable chair and sit maybe next to the window. And I think there's a very basic kind of human element in terms of that. So we want to make sure, and everybody's got different thermal preferences and comfort preferences. So you have to make sure that there's environments that can respond to that. And of course, you know, being able to control those factors so that, you know, I always think about, especially we've noticed it at home during lockdown, in the family, you know, there's constant thermostat wars. You know, it's right. If I walk past the thermostat, turn it up, someone else walks past, turns it down. And there is that kind of level of being able to create an environment which is quite easy to modify. So I don't think there's there's not really a one fix all sort of solution. I think it's very much about making sure that we're designing and building homes that are ultimately for people with varying needs, and making sure that the buildings themselves can adapt to those over time.
Thank you very much, Philip. Similarly, as we slowly but surely go back to our offices, or unfortunately spend more time in hospitals or public buildings, what can we do? You've been talking about an holistic approach. You've been talking about encouraging movement of people and obviously daylight and all those sort of things. What do you think is the key elements to guarantee a healthier environment in a commercial building?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I think Rosie has touched on a few points, and then actually our last point, I think what every sector is wrestling with at the moment is flexibility, and how we can change or adapt spaces to provide different functions. And I think taking healthcare, it's been particularly relevant there over the last 12 or so months, and not least, I suppose, our Nightingale hospitals, where all of a sudden, you know, we're converting spaces to meet new demands that, you know, we never thought about or never anticipated. You know, in that healthcare environment, we're talking about surge capacity. You know, so how can we build in the flexibility to enable, you know, the running of new pipe work or new duct work, or the changing of, you know, of functions of wards into something slightly different. So, you know, it's been pretty bleak at times, but also we've learned a lot. I think, I mean, if you take the Excel Centre where the London Nightingale landed, I mean, it's a huge shed, and that's the pinnacle of flexibility, really, you know. But we can't build every building as a big shed. And particularly as we're moving, I suppose, towards more refurbishment and adaptation of existing buildings, that the introduction of that flexibility is going to be very limited. So I think there's a few simple moves probably that we can make to sort of improve that. But I guess we've got to be also mindful of the compromises, and taking things like the acoustic performance of movable walls, for example. You know, that's something that we've wrestled with for many, many years. You know, a flexible space is one that can double in size, so you have a big wall that you can slide out of the way, but, you know, when the wall's in place, you can't have to, you know, take a school environment, for example, you struggle to have two classrooms running effectively either side of it. Or, you know, if you're looking at introducing potential unforeseen flexibility, you're looking at things like pushing your building higher. Your floor to ceilings get bigger, and so arguably your embodied carbon goes up because you're putting more material in it, or your floor area gets bigger because you're leaving space to put additional plant or future plant for increased capacities in. So it's a really difficult nut to crack, and I think there's still actually a good deal of capacity to build in the industry, sort of the understanding of circularity principles, and again, that's a whole different topic that we could talk about for hours. But, you know, there are simple moves that we can make, but it's also about understanding the impacts of those moves, I think. I mean, Rosalie's talked about fresh air, big deal. You know, we've identified, you know, or similarly, I suppose we've been asked a lot over recent months from completed projects, you know, what's the fresh air supply to these spaces, or, you know, what's going to be the impact of opening the windows, which perhaps identifies an issue of, you know, the handing over of record information, for example. You know, these organizations and client teams should probably know what we've designed for them and what's been built for them. But I think, you know, it's definitely about looking towards technology more to support some of these functions. And there are lots of, as I think Darren referred to, there are lots of retrofit solutions that you can look at: air quality monitors, light sensors, all those sorts of things that can help to inform the performance of these spaces.
Okay, thank you. And then obviously, Ute, there is a lot of research that was done in the educational spaces and light in educational spaces. So now that our kids and young people are studying from home, what can we tell them to make sure, you know, obviously the lighting you've got at home is not the same as a university or in an office. So how do we support that? How do we correct that problem?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, there is quite a lot of guidance and research that has been done and is being done sort of for work and learning environments, commercial spaces, even healthcare and hospitality. But really the sort of residential areas, there is not much guidance and research out there. And I think during the last year with the pandemic and everybody using the home as their home office and learning and living and working environment, sort of that came up to the forefront, that we actually don't really know how to use the space. We don't really have, a lot of places are not really laid out for us to spend an extensive amount of time there. And I think Rosalie already touched on some of that for ventilation, but also for lighting, right? Having access to windows, to the outside, hopefully also from different sort of directions, depending on using a space in the evening and in the morning, that the light comes from different directions. I think that is probably sort of the first layer, right? That architecture, also in the residential area, should sort of think about providing good daylighting throughout the day. With that sort of then comes sort of behavioral advice, right? I know that in the lighting and in the medical community, we always sort of tell everybody that you should take breaks and go outside and have your half-hour walk, especially in the morning or right after lunch, because we are sort of otherwise always sort of stuck indoors. And the amount of light, even if the brightness seems really high indoors and we can see very well, you will never get the amount of light that you will get outdoors. So that is also important to realize that light for physiology is sort of different what we need. And so going outside, whether it's a balcony or open a window or actually going in front of the door, is really important. But also in terms of electrical lighting, I think what we learn from the research, from work and learning environments, it all still applies. So what type of light we need for vision, and we need at what time and for what purpose, it all still applies. We just need to find the way to integrate it into the residential environment, because we purchase and we plan lighting for commercial spaces very differently. There are centralized control systems, there are different procurement and different types of fixtures. All of that doesn't happen in the residential environment. And I think we really need to rethink this and also educate, both from the planning and from the owner side and from the residents themselves.
Okay. Darren, from a hospitality perspective, obviously we don't spend as much time in a restaurant than we do at home or in the office, but is it purely about aesthetics, or is there an element of health when designing for hospitality as well?
Well, aesthetically speaking, yes, is one of the main drivers, but it's more importantly about well-being. Is how we feel in that space. We don't go into a well-lit bar, restaurant, or whatever, and feel like, wow, it's like, oh wow, I feel comfortable here. I want to spend a considerable amount of time. We can take some of those lessons and bring them into residential as well, but primarily hospitality, no, it would be mainly aesthetic and how we feel in that space. The science that we've only now discovered is not just psychological. It is physiological. So I think a lot of the ways that we were approaching some of these designs in years before, we can carry over, and we can have a more holistic approach, I suppose, that we can design spaces both that can improve our physical well-being and a psychological feeling, I suppose.
Yes, can't wait to go back to the restaurant. So that will help, definitely help my psychological well-being. Philip, we have a question from Alison. She's asking, obviously, we've been talking about fresh air and when opening windows, how important that would be. But if you are in the middle of London, what do you do about opening the window and then having all the pollution coming in? What's the compromise? What's the healthy compromise there?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I guess the current approach is to basically provide two solutions to ventilation in your buildings in city centres, and that is to ensure you're providing filtered mechanical fresh air and you're giving capacity to open windows, and both the open windows provide both, you know, comfort, tailoring, but also we hope, I suppose, that in 5, 10, 15 years we might be able to turn those mechanical units off. So at the moment, unfortunately, it's costing building procurers more money because we've got to give them two. Well, we're trying to give them two solutions because we think that's the sort of future-proofed position. But if we stick to designing and building big glass sealed up towers, for example, then that's not contributing effectively to the climate change agenda and how we can hopefully start to drive down energy. It is difficult. I mean, we're seeing, obviously there's lots of policies in London to improve and drive down air pollution, and obviously the prevalence and growing or the growth of electric vehicles is helping, but then we're still seeing, there's still the particulates like brake dust and stuff just won't go away. We're obviously losing the combustion emissions, but we're not mitigating all of them. So at the moment, unfortunately, it's sort of a double solution to try and provide the sort of current and future flexibility.
Okay. And then Rosalie, Stephen is asking, he says, it was really interesting, the idea to design for the mundane in homes. Has any work been carried out in the building types, like wet coats in school, for example?
No, that is a good question. And it's one that I don't necessarily know the answer to, but I do know that there is such a big drive now in terms of carrying out post-occupancy studies and really trying to get quite qualitative feedback from the users of the building so that can inform, a future building programme. I would like to think that the buildings we're building just now were already being informed by a process such as that. And I think in many cases they are. But I think I think the whole area of user behaviour is huge, because the number of habits and the way people use buildings vary dramatically from building to building. So building up a database of that, and that's certainly in the housing sector how we're challenging and taking some of those initiatives forward. So we work with a housing association which we see it more in obviously the public sector than we do the private sector, because the private sector just want to sell the flats and move on, whereas the local housing associations want to learn from it because they're dealing with the problems as they go along. So they want every building and every home that they commission to be interrogated as much as possible so that they can learn from that for future. So I think that might answer the question in terms of the mundane and the sort of the habitual behaviour. I don't know myself what's happening in schools and in other building types, but I think certainly there's a methodology there which could be applied to many different building types.
Okay, so while I was still with you, Andrew is asking, in post-occupancy monitoring, what kind of data are you collecting from building users, as well-being is essentially subjective and difficult to quantify?
Yeah, okay, yeah. It's that we try to get data that's both qualitative and quantitative. So the quantitative data that we gather is related to things like we put up sensors, and we usually monitor a building for quite a prolonged period of time. So we monitor carbon dioxide, And carbon dioxide is a good indicator of indoor air quality. It's generated by us kind of exhaling. So you know that a building's not being well ventilated if the CO2 levels are particularly high. They're measured in a scale called parts per million, and there's a kind of threshold that you want to make sure that your building is below. So that therefore we get very good types of data. And over a certain period of time, if the CO2 levels are too high, that's when you would feel, as a user sitting in a building, you would feel stuffy, you'd get headachy, you're not really getting enough fresh air. So that's one of the indicators. We also use monitoring equipment to evaluate the temperature and relative humidity. So we get an understanding there of what the parameters might be in terms of thresholds for mold growth and some of the unhealthy things. But really the key one in terms of how somebody feels is probably CO2. We gather data from occupants about how they feel. So we get that kind of qualitative input. But again, they're not necessarily, there's not a defined matrix for that as yet.
I can say a little bit more on that if I may. So there are a few sort of industry tools out there. So we're partners with the Building User Survey methodology, which is a sort of standardized question set. And I think that several hundred buildings have been through the process. So they now have a good degree of benchmarks. And that is predominantly exploring the qualitative aspects. And so things, there are questions around perceived productivity and perceived well-being. And so, yes, okay, it's entirely subjective, but when you start, as Rosalie says, when you start to overlay that with, you run the survey on, Thursday the 22nd of April, if you start to then look at the data in that space on Thursday the 22nd of April, you can maybe start to tease out reasons and justifications for why the responses are the way they are. So, I mean, and as I say, there are a number of tools out there, but there are ways and means of collecting that qualitative side of things fairly robustly.
Okay, thank you very much. Darren, when you appeared on Grand Designs, we were talking about biodynamic lighting. How does that help our well-being and physical health?
Well, as we've learned just how artificial light is affecting us, like I said before, particularly within that blue spectrum, we are being too stimulated at night with light. We're under too much light levels and not enough during the day, so we don't get that cycle naturally that we have evolved truly over thousands of years to live with. So the idea of biodynamic lighting, or circadian lighting, or human-centric lighting, or integrative lighting, as you say now is the agreed terminology, it really tries to mitigate the adverse effects of artificial light and the lack of daylight throughout the day. So if we can propose an adaptive system where the qualities of light in indoor space changes to reflect the qualities outdoors. So during the day, we may have huge amounts of light indoors that compensate the kind of low-level standards that we're used to. And then as the day progresses into evening, that light quality would change so that it'd be much less in the blue spectrum and much more leaning towards the warm. So then it doesn't excite that photoreceptor, and again we need to achieve very, very low light levels in the evening in order to not disrupt sleep. And that's essentially it. It's really looking at our body clocks and sleep-wake cycles, so there's the least amount of disruption as possible.
And Philip, we touched very briefly the importance of materials in designing spaces. And obviously there is always the problem that we come across in previous panels where retrofit versus new build. So if we were designing the ideal building that keep us all healthy and safe and everything else, what is the focus on materials about? I know a lot of companies now are doing antimicrobial surfaces because of coronavirus, but surely there is other elements or innovations that are available there to help us.
Yeah, again, another big agenda, big arena. Yeah, I mean, you touched on the sort of the cleaning capabilities, the maintainability of materials, which is obviously has grown in prominence over the last few months. In terms of where are we going? Where's the industry going? We're seeing an emergence of I guess standards and guidance in the specification of materials with regard to their chemical composition. So I think we're all pretty familiar with off-gassing. So things like natural timbers and things like they naturally emit things like formaldehyde. It's just a natural chemical compound. But then similarly, when you're looking at composites and laminates and things with glues and solvents, that they're either emitting elevated levels of formaldehyde or even worse things still. And actually, so there's a lot going on there, and we're back to the sort of monitoring, and we're putting in sensors and testing the sort of indoor air quality for those chemical compounds in the atmosphere, and then trying to come up with clever ways to mitigate any impacts. But sort of earlier still, it's about the specification thereof, and we're seeing red lists pop up. So there's the International Living Futures Institute red list, I think, and the Miller-Hull red list, which are basically starting to say, well, these materials, these chemical compounds should be avoided, full stop. Things like PVC, there is some scientific evidence to suggest that coming into contact with those daily and regularly can have a harmful impact on people's health and well-being, maybe the carcinogens or something like that. So we're fortunately I say fortunately, we are still in the UK governed by EU regulation. We hope to still be governed by either a comparable version of those EU regulations once the environmental bill lands in a few months, I think. But yeah, we've spent a lot of time doing a lot of research into some of these chemical compounds and exploring actually, well, is it okay to have materials with harmful stuff in them if they're sandwiched away or below the ground or whatever. And is it more about the finishes that you need to be worried about, because they're the things that people are coming into contact with and touching and all that sort of stuff. But then, where do you stop? You start looking at the supply chain, and is this thing being dug out of a horrible mine in the Far East or Siberian Russia or something? And actually, if you're really, really bothered about the health and well-being of the whole sort of building procurement supply chain, then you need to be thinking about those risks as well. And then again, there are various standards popping up, declare labels, cradle to cradle. There are lots of sort of third-party standardization things that are emerging to help frame some of this. But we at BDP are trying to define our own list and say this is what we do and don't specify. This is what we do and don't include, because there's evidence that they can be harmful. And in fact, we've started talking to manufacturers about some of these things and saying, well, actually, if your product contains this thing, we won't be specifying you. Unfortunately, we're of a size where some of them are starting to listen to us. And indeed are starting to change, the type of paint they use or whatever it is. So, hopefully that's going to grow in traction, and we won't. I guess what we're sort of looking for is the next asbestos. You know what I mean? 10, 15, 20 years down the track, all of a sudden we're going to realize something is horrifically bad for us, and it's in every building. And how do we then get rid of it? So we're just trying to see that coming, I suppose.
Okay, preventing, yeah, good idea.
Perhaps I could add to that. Could I, as part of the discussion, just wearing my architectural hat, I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I was thinking about quite a lot, in the idea between new build and retrofit. And I think actually we can learn a huge amount from existing buildings, from quite historical buildings. I mean, I'm thinking about even just Glasgow, a typical tenement, stone, heavy built masonry construction. It's locally sourced, it's got timber frame windows, and there's quite a lot in the palette of materials there. It's quite, there's a lot we can learn from that. And it's not always about finding new materials and testing new materials. Actually, a lot of the materials that we've been using for 100 years are actually, those buildings are the most sustainable buildings that are around. And some of them are really quite healthy buildings. We had larger areas, we had larger floor to ceiling heights, we had windows which we could open and sash and case windows, so there was a lot of things that we can actually learn from history. So whilst I know that the materials industry love the fact that we can go around testing new things, promote things, I actually think there's a huge palette of materials that we already have and knowledge that we already have that we can apply. So that's just kind of my alternative view to perhaps Philip's.
Well, absolutely. I mean, step one in sustainable design is don't build.
Yeah.
So,
Upgrade what we thought.
But can I sort of jump in there, because that was sort of a really great comment, and it sort of reminded me of something, sort of a saying that I've heard from medicine, right? Sort of first do no harm. And I think it's sort of like, we need to acknowledge that there are sort of some buildings and some technologies or methods that we are using that can harm its occupants, and that we are learning, right? We sort of need to observe and learn, and the moment we actually know that, make it better. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need to use sort of new materials. We can also use sort of new methods to use old materials, right? I mean, there's no, I think we just need to be honest, and acknowledge what we sort of find and then learn from that.
Okay, sounds good. Let's stay with you. I've got a question from Andrew. So on lighting, would you advocate for pre-programmed spectrum changes through the day-night cycle, or would you seek to educate users and offer options for self-control? I ask specifically in the domestic environment.
That's a really interesting and a really big question, and maybe it's not one or the other. Maybe at some point it could actually be a combination of both, because we are not always using the space or have the same needs all the time, right? So with lighting, it's really about the right light for the right purpose at the right time, and I think having overriding self-control to make sure you can mediate the light and make sure you get the light you need is really important. But controls can help to sort of provide a default that maybe works for most people most times. But then if you need something else, you can adjust, right? That would sort of be maybe the overall comment to that. Because when daylight is, when daylight is available, use daylight and you'll be fine, generally, at least at sort of the equinoxes. But unless you need to sleep during the day, or in summer in Stockholm, and you really need to manipulate and put the shades down, or for example, in winter in Stockholm or in other places, you absolutely need to supplement with electrical light. And so I think if we have some automated systems, there can be something preset. But then some people of us, they need to work in the evenings. Now then it's a question, what type of light should that be? In order to maybe mediate that you can still sleep right afterwards, but you have enough light to read. But there are sort of these questions for specific use cases where I think you need to be able to change it and control it yourself. And then education again is important.
And a really quick point as well, just highlight something that we did say as well. The lighting industry is currently changing dramatically and very quickly. We've already started seeing some products come out there where they're manipulating the spectrum so that it may be that you only use certain light from a domestic point of view. You may only use certain light sources at certain times of day because of the qualities that it gives. Like I said, some LED manufacturers are completely removing a lot of that blue from the spectrum so that you can use those light sources later at night without stimulating the photoreceptors too much. And again, technology is improving all the time, though, where we can incorporate adaptive or Bluetooth wireless lighting into retrofit homes for very, very cost-effective means. So I think in the next few years, we could probably start having a more intelligent conversation about this, both between consumers, designers, suppliers, everything. I think to be a lot more in tune to what's needed.
Thank you. Rosalie, I want you to go back very quickly to the housing world. And sometimes, well, I think there was some research that showed new builds, especially on a budget, are actually not that good for your physical health because they're using bad materials, or the ventilation is not done properly, or other problems. What is the level of policy making? Do you think the building standards are up to an appropriate level, or is there work to be done there to make sure all new builds, whether they come from a council, a state, or a posh home or a budget house, meet a minimum of requirement to make sure they're actually healthy environment for us?
Yeah, I think new builds are a tricky one. They're certainly, as I say, the social housing sector is leading the way and pushing the guidelines a wee bit further. So rather than just meeting the minimum, they're quite willing to kind of say, well, no, we want to look a wee bit further. I mean, and I think we have to be looking to our European neighbours to be looking at some better thermal standards. I think the British standards certainly could be improved upon. And there has to be an element of buy-in as well from the private sector to not only meet the minimum. There's the schemes such as Passive House or BREEAM higher ratings are kind of voluntary at the housing level as opposed to regulatory. So I think there has to be an element of that. I think there's plenty of advice out there about good design. But again, making it regulatory is a different step altogether. So it's a difficult balance between ensuring that we're stimulating the growth to meet the housing demand at the moment, but making sure we get that right as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware of time, so maybe last couple of questions. Darren, Eoin is asking, how is the science of circadian rhythm developing? What are the schools of thought today, and what are the arguments for different solutions? It is difficult today to land on an artificial lighting solution that meets some scientific proven method. What are the panel looking at today?
Well, there are so many different trains of thought. It's so many different standards as well, not even a lot of the research. It would be a better place to answer this, but again, a lot of the research initially was led by suppliers as well. So there was lots of information flying out there about, the benefits of circadian lighting. I think a little bit before it's fully understood. There are, I guess, to look at the likes of maybe like the WELL standard, for example, they focus on melanopic lux levels. So rather than, in terms of visual performance, rather than measuring the reflected light from a surface, which we used to consider as the most necessary, it's more about what the actual eye is receiving. So again, there's nothing set in stone. BCO, for example, they focus more on the quality of views, on how much, not only daylight you receive, but how far you can see and what you see in the window, from the window. So there's, again, I'm sorry, there's nothing agreed. We can look at all these different standards to try and get some sort of framework of what's expected, and look at kind of some of the more leading manufacturers as well, from some of the research that they're producing, to kind of factor in what's best. But it's also the use of the building. It's really important to know how long the building will be used throughout the day. A lot of the circadian rhythm and biodynamic lighting systems are buzzwords that developers are looking to incorporate within offices. But if people are only going to occupy the space between 9 and 5, then it kind of defeats the purpose of having a system like that. And maybe we look at alternative solutions, more cost-effective solutions that would still probably meet a similar set of standards in terms of well-being, but not have huge cost implications of smart, adaptive control systems.
Maybe sort of a very, in general, I think there is something that at least probably all of the recommendations sort of agree. In general, it is about getting a lot of bright light in the morning or during the early daytime, because that will sort of signal to the body clock, hey, it's daytime. It's about being active, right? It's sort of resetting the circadian clock. And in the evening, for people who sort of work during the day or live during the day and sleep at night, and in the evening to have the exact opposite, right? To sort of have low level lighting or darkness, and then generally it's sort of tuned to the warmer spectrum, and in the morning it's sort of tuned to the sort of more white or cooler spectrum. I think that everybody sort of agrees, and the melanopic lux that Darren sort of mentioned from the WELL standard, or the MEDI, the melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance that I sort of mentioned from the CIE, all those are measures that are similar, that are sort of pointing to that. So I think there's no disagreement there. The question is, how much is enough? How much is too much? So scientists and researchers together in sort of practice-based research are trying to sort of fine-tune what are actually sort of the recommendations and the levels. And then also what happens for other user groups? What happens if you are not one of the people who work and live during the day and sleep at night? What are then sort of the dangers or the recommendations there? Does the lighting need to change, or do we give out sunglasses to just sort of shield people individually from light? So those are sort of discussions that are happening.
I think also, just really quickly, sorry, as the awareness of this increases as well, it may be worth looking at more, as I said before in the presentation, agile ways of working. It could be that if it's a case that we want to be back in the office, but we carry out most of our phone conversations by a large window so we get the daylight. If it's a case that we need constant and uniform light, if we, let's say, work in like an architect's office and we're working with plans, maybe that could be in the center of the building, and we conduct our meetings or conversations around where there's more natural light or ventilation. I think how we use buildings dramatically change. It can't be just considered solid forms in which to do everything. We need to perhaps consider a more holistic way of interacting with our environment.
Fantastic. So to wrap up, I'm going to ask you all the same question. Rosalie, let's kick off with you. What does health mean for architecture? You need to unmute yourself, Rosalie.
Does health mean? I think I would probably just reiterate some of the things that, or the themes that I've said, and I would just say that from a health perspective, we need buildings which can accommodate behaviour, occupants' patterns, behaviours and habits, to create environments that make them feel good for their health and well-being.
Yeah, Philip?
I think from, I suppose, the sort of conceptual perspective, I mean, we've talked a lot about it. It's reconnecting with the natural world and biological cycles. I mean, that's fresh air, daylight, green space, whatever it is, all those sorts of things are really important to us. And I think for, sort of at the building scale, as Rosie says, it's, it's configurable, customizable spaces that, encourage productivity and comfort and all those sorts of things. So you know, it's very broad, but ultimately it's about creating a place, places for people so they can thrive, I think.
Okay, Ute.
Yeah, I actually second Philip here. I think we need to sort of acknowledge that living and working environments affect us. And then to the best of our knowledge, I think there is a responsibility to build them in a way that support us, and both psychologically, physiological, and introduce sort of, I don't know. I mean, it's always sort of difficult to say sort of the feel good, right? But I think sort of a lot of it, we're obviously working on measuring, right? Can we measure sort of the health impact of buildings? And we hopefully we are working on it, and hopefully the whole community will get to that. But also just acknowledging, like, how do people feel intuitively, and designing an environment that supports our activities.
Okay, and last but not least, Darren, your magic thoughts.
Well, I guess again, it's just to sum up what everyone else has already said, that I think the facts are in that we are inextricably linked to our environment. And that's from the materials that we choose for our walls, ceilings, floors, or the light. We can't get away from that. We are influenced by so many different things. I think, as Ute says, as more research is being done and we come close to quantifying what well-being and health in architecture really is, and what that looks like, then I think we can't trace away from it. But the more and more we have these discussions now, I think encourages only good change.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for your time, and for our audience for the questions, and again, for listening to us. It's been a pleasure to have you on board today. We'll be back probably June with a new topic, and hopefully you can join us again. Thanks again to our fantastic sponsors, Domus and Schluter Systems. And I wish you all a lovely day, and speak soon. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.